Well, good morning. My name's Tom Fletcher, and I'm an alcoholic. Oh, I'm sorry. This is wrong meeting. Wrong meeting. I'm sorry. How many are Army people in here? Raise your hands. Navy, Marines,
Hoorah.
Air Force, and Coast Guard. All right. Thank you guys all for your service. Really appreciate it. How many Vietnam veterans do we have? Welcome home. Welcome home. This is a little new for me, and I said, okay, what do I have to do with this? And he said, well, it's just like telling one long sea story from going down to the recruiter in downtown Denver and starting there. So I'll just do that. You know the difference between a fairy tale and a sea story?
Yeah.
Some people do. Fairy tale starts out once upon a time, and a sea story starts out, this is no shit. All right, so this is no shit, all right? I joined the Coast Guard from Denver, Colorado in 1965, and it was kind of a struggle to get in. They weren't taking very many people, and I walked across the hall in 1965 to the Marine Corps recruiter. This was in the old Customs building, and said, take me. The only thing I knew about then, what was going on in the world, was something that had 8 spark plugs and 300 horsepower, and kind of a year out of high school, working on building houses. And I knew you were supposed to apply for the draft and get registered when you were 18, and I thought, well, that's 12 months. I've got plenty of time. So the Marine Corps said that my eyesight was too bad to get in the Marine Corps. Maybe thank goodness. So I thought, well, what else do I want to do? And I really didn't want to go to the Army, and I really didn't want to be in the Navy, but the Navy had the Seabees, and I thought, you know what, I wanted to be an electrician. I'll join the Seabees, and I'll get my training there, and then I can come back and be an electrician. So the Navy had moved over to the new Customs house in downtown Denver, so it was go from really the foot of Spear Boulevard into downtown Denver. Went over and talked to the Navy recruiter, and it was late in the afternoon, and he said, you know, come in tomorrow, and due to some circumstances I won't get into with a girlfriend in Rhode Island and me living in Denver, I said I will join the Navy and let them know back in. First I let them know I was joining the Coast Guard, then I told them no, actually it was the Navy. And then I'd gotten drafted, so went back to the Navy recruiter the next morning, and he had all the paperwork all signed up and slid it across the desk to me, and his phone rang, and he handed it to me, and he said, it's your mother. And I said, really? And she said, the Coast Guard recruiter just called and he can get you a waiver, and he wants you to come back over and see him. And I looked at the Navy recruiter, and I just said, I gotta go. And I just got up and turned around and left, and then went back across town and joined the Coast Guard then. And I thought, well, this is good, because I can get in the Coast Guard, I can go back and get stationed in Rhode Island, I can see this girl, and we'll figure out how everything is gonna work out. Well, instead of going to Newport, Rhode Island, I sent to Newport, Oregon. That was kind of the end of that romance as well. But going to Newport, Oregon was a small station, 25 guys. We had an E7 chief in charge, and our job was search and rescue. And these are the boats basically that were at that station. And the small one here at the end was an old wooden 36-footer. That one was built in during the Depression, and was really a good boat because it was built in the Depression. They spent a lot of extra time and did a lot of extra woodwork with it, made it stronger than some of the others. So they all started out at the first 2 numbers are the length, and then 300. Don't ask me why the Coast Guard started at 300, but that was the first one of that class that they built. So this was the 123rd one of that style made, and they made them, those 36-footers, with various degrees of changes and engine improvements and that kind of stuff for, gosh, probably almost 50 years. So that boat was built in the 30s when I got on it in 65. So it was a pretty old boat then. The 44 footer. This was the first one that was built. Coast Guard made them in Curtis Bay, built them there, and this one ended up in Oregon for testing. They did a lot of changes on that 300 boat, and this one in 65 hadn't been changed that one. It was built in 1960, and it hadn't been altered that much. It had subsequently after that for years. That was like the guinea pig boat, and it was made out of all kinds of pieces. Was a steel hull and aluminum superstructure, and there were some welding and connection issues with it. But this was the workhorse of the Coast Guard, and I don't know, they've probably made several hundred of those that since now in the last 15 years have replaced that with a 47 footer that's a little more friendly to be in. All these are open cockpits, and they're pretty much, if you're out there in the crappy weather, and that's usually when they said you need to get in it and go. They never said you had to come back, but you had to get in it and go. The 52 footer was built in 1956, and this was kind of the we call it the pig because it didn't go very fast. It was probably about 11 knots, and the 44 footer would do about 15 or 16. This one was really the long distance heavy tow boat, and I don't remember, it's probably had 700 or 800 horsepower with twin engines. But if you needed to go out and get something big and tow it in, you took the 52. And it had some bunk space in it. It had a little galley. Took a crew of 4 or 5. It was a lot better boat and could handle a lot rougher water with the 52, obviously. But all 3 of these boats were all designed to roll over and come back up. The fuel tanks on the 44 footer were triangles. And so when the boat was upside down, that triangle was on the apex or the top of the triangle or whatever. So it was very unstable with that up there and had a tendency, I guess, to flip it back over faster. But flipping it over faster was usually about, I don't know, 15, 16 seconds. It was a long time if you're upside down in that thing. I was never in a boat that rolled over, but I was in a few of these that when you were going through waves and you looked up, they were about here, and you were going to go through the back of them. We took really the superstructure of this one. We took the top part of that off one day, took the windows out of it and everything. But tough boats, keep going, and we probably had an assistance case where we towed somebody in probably in the summertime. Sometimes you didn't stop. There was a boat towing somebody day and night. Sports fishermen, commercial fishermen, that kind of stuff. We had a few people in the water, a few airplanes crash along the coast, and some of that stuff that we responded to, but most of it was the job of going out and getting somebody that had broken down, towing them in. So that was our primary job in Oregon, was search and rescue. After being on the coast for a few years, then I went up to a cutter out of Seattle, and I say a big cutter. It was 255 feet long, and you Navy guys will laugh. You had fenders to keep you from scratching the paint that were about the same size, and they used us for that over in Vietnam to keep from scratching up the destroyer tenders and put us between all the Navy ships and kept us from the Navy from beating each other up, so they put us in between them. But the Coast Guard Cutter Wachusett was a 255-foot cutter, and my friend Jack here was on another one. He thought his was the only one, and he found out later that there was actually more than one. And I like to give him a bad time about that too. I asked for a transfer, and I knew the cutter was going to end up going to Vietnam. I needed the sea time to get advanced in rate. And so I left the Oregon coast and went up to Seattle, got on the cutter, and we spent months at a time going out to the middle between San Francisco and Hawaii, and there's a square mile of ocean out there that's gridded off with letters, And when you get into that grid, OS is the center point of that grid, and you broadcast a radio beacon. And this was for aircraft, and they would home in on your radio signal. And when they went over the top of you, you were on station OS, and then they'd continue on to Hawaii. And they had ditched a plane, was it in 57?
October 56.
56. Pan Am Clipper lost 2 engines on the way to San Francisco and ended up ditching out there. It was at the Pontchartrain?
Correct.
And they rescued everybody off that. They kept them in the air until daybreak the next morning, and then they ditched the plane alongside the cutter, and they saved everybody off the plane. So it was like a lighthouse, but it was for us on the deck force, it was where you went out and you painted half the main deck. And next time you go out, you're gonna get the other half. So it was work from sun up to sundown, 7 days a week. But it took us about 4 days to get out there from Seattle. Then we'd spend 3 weeks on station, and then we'd get another cutter would come out and relieve us, and they'd bring us some fresh milk, fresh vegetables, and mail. And that was the neatest sight, to see a white spot start coming over the horizon. Yeah, because you knew you were getting mail. Yeah.
Tom, when we were flying to Vietnam, I remember you guys being between Hawaii and the coast, sitting out there, because we used you as parts of our beacon.
Mm-hmm. And sometimes when, right, when I think Nixon was flying to Guam, maybe, when he was having some conferences, they would give us another coordinate, and we'd have to just haul ass up there and get to that spot at a certain time and be there, and then they'd fly over, and then we'd back to Ocean Station November again. But I don't know how many planes. I wasn't involved in the CIC guys, Combat Information Center, that did all the radar geeky stuff, but they would track these guys on about a 6-foot diameter plastic lighted board, and we were in the center of it, and they'd get radar contacts, and they'd mark these guys coming across. And if you had the mid-watch from midnight to 4 in the morning, and you're sitting out there in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, you had nothing to do, so you go in there and talk to these guys a little bit and see what was going on, and they'd be conversing back, and they knew most of the pilots by the end of the 3rd week. And one night, there was a contact, and this search radar, I think, went 100 miles, so it was a 200-mile radius. And so up at the very top of it, they got a contact, and they, okay, we'll mark it, and then the radar would make another sweep, and I think it'd take about 30 seconds to make a sweep, and the contact moved. And I thought, wow, we've got something there. But the normal passenger planes would move about 3 inches at a jump on a radar sweep going across you. And this one was coming down from the north, and it was moving about 14 or 15 inches each time the radar would sweep. And it was making this big arc, and they tried to call it on every frequency that they possibly could, and never got a response. And then about 5 days later, it happened again. And it was this other big arc, which would be probably, it didn't fit inside the 200 miles, so it was 300 or 400 miles to make a loop. And I found out later when I was off at Air Force Base that the Blackbird was flying out of Edwards, and it said it flew around a spot in the Pacific Ocean and it went back to Edwards. So that was us, and we actually had the Blackbird out there making these 900 mile an hour or 900 mile U-turns around us and headed back for the coast. So that was the only exciting thing that ever happened out there. You get up in the morning, and the deck force job was to throw the flying fish off the deck, and then you usually started painting right after chow, sometimes before chow. But sometimes that was just like being on a lake out there, and sometimes it was just rougher than hell. But, question?
Can you give us an idea of the crew size and the draft?
120
120
to 140.
Yeah, people, and the draft finally ended up about 17 feet. But compared to a Navy destroyer, it was a lot wider, beam-wise. So it rode a lot better, but it was still a single screw, single engine I have a whole book here about it, and there's some complimentary comments and some not so much. Those cutters were built to replace cutters that the Coast Guard gave Britain, 250 footers in World War II. And in that process, two were sunk, Britain kept one, they scrapped a couple, and the Coast Guard got about 5 or 6 back. I don't remember the whole total of that, of the 13. But we got several of them back, and a couple of them were in bad enough shape after World War II. And this is really in a space of about 4 years. They were in such bad shape that they only recommissioned, I think, 3 of them. And then they got into a building process in 1946 to replace those. And there's a lot of stories about how this 255-footer got to be. It was supposed to be a 355-footer, and they took an engine room out and shortened it, and a lot of different comments about it. But they were built in 46 and 47. One thing I was going to tell you guys before I got started even, I did get a letter. I know none of you other guys probably got this letter. Jack did. The other day from the Coast Guard. And it says, "Dear Coast Guard retiree, as the partial government shutdown continues, the U.S. Coast Guard remains unfunded and is unclear." And then goes on to say that you'll get your pay when we get our money. So I got this yesterday in the mail. Dated January 23rd. So I don't imagine any of you other guys got a letter like this, but the Coast Guard is in the under Homeland Security Department. When I started out and Jack started out, the Coast Guard was in the Treasury Department. So we could print our own money, I guess. We kind of got there because the Coast Guard started out, it's an inception in stopping smuggling into the United States, and they needed to collect those duties and tariffs for our country's income. And so they were preventing smuggling at the very beginning. And that's why we went over to Vietnam, was to prevent smuggling. And they thought, boy, that's perfect. You guys can go do that over there. It changed to the Transportation Department. Kennedy got that started, and the Coast Guard got a little more publicity, and they started putting stripes on everything. I think some of the pictures you'll see, we got a big racing stripe on there that's red and blue, and a little more, I don't know, what do you want to call it? Identifiable, right. The Coast Guard's about the same size as the New York City Police Department, so it's not very big. The first station I was at had 25 guys. The station I moved up to, up the coast, had 8. And I was the exec as an E4. Yeah. Had a first class in charge, or an E6 in charge. And I was the executive officer as an E4 with 2.5 years in the Coast Guard. So 8 guys. We didn't have a place to stay on the station. We had a trailer or apartment or something to live in, and you had 3 minutes to be on the boat. When they had a big air raid siren there, and when something happened, you had 3 minutes to be on the boat, or you were in trouble. So to go a mile out of town, and each end of town had a tavern, and the tavern was like 1.1 miles away from the station. You had to get an out of bounds pass, which was probably pretty good because at least they knew where you were. But that was kind of how we lived then. And then for a while, and this is the Oregon coast, and the Oregon coast gets about 100 inches of rain a year. My first transportation there for the first 3 months was a 10-speed bike. So I lived far enough away that I could get on the bike and make it to the station in 3 minutes, and that was it. And after that, I got a trailer that was right behind the station. Somebody got transferred, and the trailer was there, and I think 10 of us probably had been owners of it, and we just kept making payments. All right, you want the trailer? Here's where you send your payment, move in, and you're all set to go. So you did your own cooking, and you did everything else, and it was a little town of about 300 people. But when you towed a boat in Depoe Bay, the next morning there'd usually be a bottle of whiskey sitting by the door, the front of the station, and we had 3 paint lockers out in back, those flammable storage cabinets. One had paint in it, and the other 2 had booze. So we just take it, lock it up in the paint locker, and then at New Year's in that little town, the whole town partied, and they partied hard. And the Coast Guard supplied all the whiskey, and the town supplied all the food, and it was rock and roll. It got so bad that 2 of the big hotel owners there, and this is Depoe Bay, Oregon, 2 of the hotel owners, the group commander who was in charge of the whole Oregon coast, tried to get the boat underway. That was this 36-footer over here. Tried to get it underway, but they were so drunk they couldn't get it untied. They got it started, but they couldn't get it untied, and they probably would have killed themselves and lost the boat had they got underway. But it was quite a town. But if you needed anything and you were in the Coast Guard, they just handed it to you, no questions asked. We put up a Christmas display in Newport that would probably rival any other town anywhere in the United States. And we'd go up to Weyerhaeuser with a Coast Guard truck and say, "You guys got any plywood you don't want?" And they would just load it up. And we built a place that we could put choirs in that looked down Main Street along the waterfront that was probably as big as this room. No permits, no nothing else. We just started building it and just kept on going. And then we couldn't get it torn down. Anyway, it was really quite a I guess inspirational thing to be in a small town and be liked and accepted as much as we were in those little Oregon towns. It was hard to go up on the cutter, but it was something we had to do. We went to Vietnam in June of 1968, came back in July of '69, and our job off the coast of Vietnam was that we were a mothership to Navy swift boats and some of those other river forces. The Coast Guard had a bunch of 82-footers that they'd sent over there that were Coast Guard manned. They'd also had a bunch of old 95-footers that they gave to Thailand, and Thailand painted those up battleship dark gray and just put guns everywhere on them, and they were also there was like maybe one 95-footer from Thailand and a couple of 82-footers, and then maybe up to 30 Navy swift boats that we were a mothership for. And we had a doctor on board. We had a little surgery bay there that we could take care of some small things or minor things, and that was our job, was to provide gunfire support. These guys would go up the river and piss everybody off, and then they couldn't get back down the river. And so that was kind of our goal. I think that's the way I looked at it, as being part of the 5-inch gun crew. Was they just went up there and caused trouble, and sometimes we'd just take off and head down and let everybody think that we weren't coming back, and then turn around and fire back up there again, and then start shooting up and down the rivers and stuff. So that was our job. The Navy guys liked us because we had an ice cream machine. And I guess I'll just tell you, if this sees how this is sea stories. One time we had some Army guys come on board, and they had a little cove, and I don't know how big it maybe it was a mile across, I don't know, but it had a little entrance, and then kind of like a golf club and turned off to the right. And it was like being in downtown Golden, where the mountains just kind of dropped down to the sea. This was up north of Da Nang, and the mountains just came right down into the water. And they said, well, there was VC and all kinds of crap going on in there, and they had storage areas and everything that they wanted to get in there and shoot. But seeing as how the mountains were there, they couldn't get planes in right, and they couldn't shoot from the water. And they said, well, we got a deal for you guys. You guys are shallow draft, and you want to have some fun. We'll set this up, and we'll mark all these targets that are inside this mountain range, kind of inside this little cove. And one dark night, we'll run you guys in there with your ship, and you guys can just run through there real quick and just shoot everybody and just keep on going and then run out. So they thought, well, that was good. And some of you guys know about weapons, and the 5-inch gun has a director that they need to have something to aim at. So they were going to go in there in the dark, and if you aim over here at this, they know coordinates. You can aim, turn your gun directed over here, deflection and elevation and everything else, and you can, if you're on one spot that you know where it is, you can aim the gun anywhere else you want to. So we said, God, that really sounds like a lot of fun. Well, we need somebody to go out there then and put a light in the water so we'll have a place to aim at. So I was the ready boat coxswain on the Wachusett, and so they dressed me up in all the flak gear they could find, give you a 45, and we got a couple of M16s and an M60 on this little 22-foot boat that's painted white.
Target.
Yeah. And so we have these float lights that were hooked on like there with your life ring. So if you throw a life ring over, this light turns up and lights up, all right? So I said, we'll take one of those and we'll put a bunch of shackles and a bunch of scrap metal on it, and we'll figure out how deep we want you. We know right where we want you to drop that light, and we'll tell you on the radio, turn right, turn left, go a little further, go a little further. And then we'll tell you when, and the ship will start in this cove, and we'll tell you when to light the light, and then you get the hell out of there, okay? This is a piece of cake. So we're taking this boat in there, and there's no moon, it's dark, and we're just idling in. And as we get closer to it, we can actually see the water kind of splashing up on the beach. And we're thinking, do you guys know where we are, really? Because they're watching us on the radar and telling us where they want this light dropped. And we know we're really getting shallow water, but up ahead of us, the beach comes, and it's, 30, 40, 50 feet, and then it just goes right up the hill. And it's just like an amphitheater with these mountains around us, and all you can see is these little campfires. But every 15 or 20 feet, somebody's cooking dinner. And these are people we're going to start shooting at. And we're watching all these little fires in here, and we're getting just idling in a little closer, and they said, okay, light it and get the hell out of there. So on the other side of the boat, we put all this stuff down the water and got this light hanging there and said, let's go. So we hit the throttle and took off, left that light there, and the light comes on. As we're looking over our shoulder, those little campfires just went, they were gone. And then like 2 seconds later, here come a 5-inch shell, white phosphorus. They were alternating white phosphorus and high explosive, just kind of scatter everything out and make it burn. And they just came in. And how fast would the 5-inch shoot? What time between rounds?
You usually do about 6 a minute, probably.
Okay. So like every 10 seconds, here comes another one. Jack is a gunner's mate. He knows, he's got all that stuff memorized, even in retirement. So we're going out, and the Wachusett is coming in, and they're going to make this big loop, and they're just blam, blam, blasting along there, and we just took off as fast as we could. But anyway, that was my sea story, I guess, for our experiences in Vietnam. Otherwise, sometimes we'd anchor, and we made a bridle out of a 6-inch towing hawser that we shackled to the anchor, and we'd just drop anchor, and we could adjust that bridle back and forth and just sit there in the current facing the coast and just shoot. And we'd shoot, break for lunch, come back. The spotter plane would fill up with gas, and he'd be back after lunch, and we'd shoot again. And that was our life over there. I think we shot over 1,000 rounds of ammunition and got rid of all the old World War II stuff. God, we'd have to unrep from Navy ships and get supplies, food, ammunition and stuff would come over on a span wire, and we would be cruising along next to an oiler or one of the supply ships, and that's how we got this stuff. And sometimes you'd get these cartons of ammunition, and they'd be old brass shells marked 45 and 46 and stuff from World War II. And the brass shells we never gave back to them, did we, Jack? No. They got all the steel ones back. The brass ones ended up in Hong Kong. And we traded, I don't know, a ton of brass maybe, and they would, in Hong Kong, they'd come aboard your ship and they'd paint it in, what, a day? The whole thing.
They painted with rags, that always amazed me.
Rags or nylon hose, like they just take it and fluff it up and get a big wad of it like that, in the gallon of paint, and just start painting with it. And Mary Sue was the little gal's name. She was about this tall. It's a little Chinese gal, and she ran a crew of people, and they'd come over and they'd take all your garbage and everything. You didn't get rid of anything that didn't go through Mary Sue, and she recycled it and passed it on, and orphanages and everything. She was quite a little gal, but she was about that big. So we went to Hong Kong once for R&R. I was supposed to be there for 3 days, and then the ship that was supposed to come in and be station ship, which ran the shore patrol for everybody, something happened. They had to go to Subic and get something fixed. So we had to stay there then for the 3 weeks, and then another couple of days after that, before the next ship came in and relieved us. But being shore patrol in Hong Kong was really kind of neat, and my job was to run the small boat every other day. And after the other days, I had liberty, and we wandered through Hong Kong. At that time, you had to be in uniform, but you could wander through Hong Kong, and after being there for almost a month, it was pretty neat. So anyway, after that, I got out. I came back to Colorado and waited 5 years. I got my electrical apprenticeship done. And I thought, boy, I'll cut me a little fat hog here and I'll get back in the Coast Guard Reserve and be an electrician. And I go, oh, we don't need electricians. We're doing boating safety. So I went back into the bosun mate business and then spent another 24 in the reserves doing boating safety around Colorado. And then for a while I commuted to Omaha, commuted to Mobile, Alabama, and commuted to Seattle then for like the last, the commuting was about the last 8 years. And then when I made W4, they couldn't give me any more money, and I couldn't do anything else. And I thought, okay, we're good, we're done. So that was it. I think it was about 2000 when I got out. But I saw the transition from being an all-male service to being one that was very integrated with women, and I think in the Coast Guard that worked fantastic. We have women now that are commanding officers of some of the patrol boats, which are probably up to 160, 70 foot long boats, and they're commanding officers of them. What's the transition going from the reservist doing a reserve thing to strictly augmentation? The resources for the Coast Guard are so minimal that if you're in the reserves, you have to go to a regular station and help them there. And if you can't do that, you're not in the reserves. So that's why the commuting from Denver, it was my dime. I flew and got out there on my own money, but it was worth it there for quite a while. What else was I going to say? Something about, told you how big the Coast Guard was, about the size of the New York City Police Department. Yeah.
Yeah, the Coast Guard is always known for doing more with less. You never had a lot of money. Has that gotten any better since you left DHS? Or worse?
Let me read this letter again here.
But you keep your ships in the water longer than the Navy keeps their stuff in the water, right?
Yeah, there's some old sayings about that. If you can't steal it from the Navy, you probably won't make do. And we did a lot of that. One time on a reserve patrol on a 210-foot cutter out of San Pedro, the gunner's mates went up and took parts off of the 3-inch in front of the VFW so we could do gunnery with the Navy, and that was kind of typical. In Seattle, they had some great big buildings there alongside the piers that were storage lockers for Navy ships, and the Coast Guard just kind of used that pier a little bit. There was 3 of us that are tied up there, and we had holes cut in them and hidden so that we could get in, and we could go through that whole probably 1,000-foot long warehouse of Navy stuff, and we would just go down through there, get whatever you needed. It was like that continuously. I remember in Vietnam, one of the 82-footers pulled alongside, and they were willing to trade anything for a spool of like 1-inch 1,000-foot of manila line, because they didn't have a tow line or something, and they were willing to trade anything for it. I got to work on the Exxon Valdez spill, and that was probably one of the highlights of Coast Guard ingenuity up there, because it was almost like they went over with a C-130 and just started pushing stuff out the door and said, use it, make do. Well, what they ended up doing was they had Zodiac boats up there, and some were different manufacturers, so the transoms were different. So some needed a long shaft outboard motor, some needed a short shaft. Well, you didn't know what you were going to get until you opened up the box, and none of it matched. So that was one of my jobs when I got up there in August, was to go through and find out where the Zodiacs were, who had them, and who had motors that actually worked with them. And some of the guys had traded them to one of the cutters that was up there, and so they had like a wreck boat now, because these guys couldn't use it, so the cutter traded them something for it. I don't know what. But it was trying to get all that stuff sorted back out again. But yeah, the Coast Guard is extremely underfunded and for the most part undermanned. And the jobs that they've been given lately don't help at all. And you've got people over doing oil platform security off the coast of Kuwait, and that's been going on for years. And between that and migrant interdiction and fisheries patrol, and I don't think they're doing much with the iceberg patrol anymore. But if there's some job that somebody wants to have done and they don't know who can do it, the Coast Guard usually ends up with it.
Tom, did I hear we only have 1 or 2 active icebreakers now in the system?
We have one primarily an icebreaker. We have quite a few small boats that have icebreaker hulls. Well, we have the Beckett, which is an icebreaker in the Great Lakes, but a lot of the other boats have icebreaker hulls. Congress just approved $1 million this week for the development of a new icebreaker because of all the problems we're having in the northern Bering Sea up north. The objective, of course, is to get several, because nobody else in the military, U.S.-wise, has icebreakers. So we have the Healy, which is a small icebreaker, and then a Polar Sea, which is a larger one, which does Antarctic and the North. So, but the objective, of course, is to have 5 or 6, but that's $500 million apiece. So whether that happens or not, it's going to happen. But how it happens, I don't know.
My brother joined in '77 and went right straight on to an icebreaker. But at the time, the Polar Star and the Polar Sea were up in the Bering Strait doing trials, and one of them screwed up the props, or one of them was up there anyway. The propellers were, instead of reversing the engines, the propellers would reverse. And the icebreakers typically back up and then pull forward and go slide up on the ice, and then they have huge pumps and they transfer water and weight up there and break down through it and then back up and do it again. And so one of them was stuck up there, and they didn't know if they were going to get it out before it got frozen in. And then up there, as the Earth turns, I guess, I don't know, the ice rotates on the polar cap. And they were at the point of Russia where they weren't sure if they were going to go to the north or to the south. So they had prepared a crew up there to winter over and get everybody else off of it and just see what happened. If it, I don't know, it was like 30 years it was going to take to go around to where they could get it out if it went above Russia. But it ended up going south, and they got it out of there. But at that time, they were supposed to do the testing and then head for Antarctica, the 2 breakers. Well, I only had one of them. So Burton Island was one of the old Navy breakers that was World War II. And so they pulled that from San Diego up to Alameda, California, towed it up there, and my brother's boot camp company graduated with another one a week early, and they marched those guys from graduation down to load stores on the Burton Island, and they took off 2 days later, headed for Antarctica. So that's the kind of stuff they get into. But yeah, that was okay, we got to do something, and we got to do it now. And the Navy helped out with that by bringing that breaker up. So he did that. It was an 8-month tour down to Antarctica, breaking into McMurdo Sound down there to get that opened up.
You want to share the story on your shirt?
Oh, this is my favorite shirt. And this is Andy Fitzgerald. And we've had I don't know how many meetings when we get together, and everybody knew Andy, but nobody knew about Andy. In fact, how many years was it? 8 years his wife? You didn't know?
He didn't even share the story with his wife.
Yeah, never shared the story with his wife. But this kind of commemorates the rescue that was off of Cape Cod in, what was the date?
February the 15th, 1952.
This is like the guy behind the announcers at football that say this is the guy that did it. So these two old World War II type oil tankers, two of them broke in half during this storm, and this Chatham Mass sent out 36-footer like this one right here. I think it has a maximum capacity of about 18. It's got a survivor's compartment up here. This is steering gear. This is engine. So that's really all there is to it. They heard about this this shipwreck going on, and the crew was in the after section of this thing, which was still afloat. And so they sent the 36-footer out, and in that process of trying to get out, I mean, this is one of the worst storms that New England had experienced. They did get out, and they had lost their compass, and they lost a bunch of other stuff on that. I think they still had a radio, but they did lose the compass. But the boat was really compromised, and there was 4 guys on it, and Andy was one of the guys that was with them as a crew member. And they got out and found this stern of this tanker that was floating. Was there 32 guys on it, Jack?
Yeah, they rescued 32 plus the 4 crew members.
So they only lost 1 guy off of that rescue. But there's a movie out, and it's called The Finest Hour. And you guys want to watch a movie that'll just kind of give your skin the creeps. This little boat's trying to get up alongside probably a 40 or 50 foot high hulk of a ship with guys trying to get off of it and get on this thing. So they got 32 guys rescued on this boat that's supposed to hold 18. Got them back in safely. And really, God was helping them, because there's no way you could, without a compass, figure out where you were going in that storm. But they got them, they rescued everybody. Andy was on that crew. And I had built this boat, I don't know, maybe 10 years ago. And I took it to one of our luncheons. And I brought it in there. I said, this is the boat that I learned how to run. And we were introducing guys in the room, and these are all coasties. And Andy got up and introduced himself, and he said, "That brings back a memory," and started telling us this story. Nobody knew it. And like I say, it took something like 5 or 6 years before he even told his wife about what went on. But anyway, he was presented a gold life-saving medal, which is the Coast Guard's highest award, and usually it's given to civilians. Very seldom is it given to Coast Guard people, but he got a gold life-saving medal for it, and it was just amazing. But the movie, Finest Hour, it's really very realistic about what happened, very accurate with what happened with that rescue. So if you guys want to watch a really neat Coast Guard movie, that might be the only one.
Andy passed away last year. He lived in Aurora all these years. Well, not all, but he lived in, not all the years, but as his job moved him to Denver, but he lived in Aurora. And I met him one time at the Wings Over the Rockies ceremony, because they always have you stand up if you're the Coast Guard, Navy, you know what I mean? So we stood up, and Andy and I were the only 2 guys standing up. So that's how I met Andy. And actually, it was an usher came over, and he says, that guy over there has a gold life-saving medal. And so I went over and talked to him, and that's how Andy and I got together. And Andy and I, the last time we were together, we went to Chatham, Massachusetts, where this happened. And in Orleans, you see the bottom of his shirt there, Orleans Historical Society keeps this boat restored, and every summer they put it back in the water. So when Andy shows up at this rescue station at Chatham, why, you know, all the flags and everything becomes a big deal, right? And that's a big history in Chatham. So they took Andy out, and his family, and his wife, and did all that stuff. And they went out 3 times. And so the guy that's in charge of that was a lieutenant commander from the Navy. He called himself the coxswain of the boat. And so he said, just wait till the last crew. So he went out, and so I sailed around on that 36-500 right there for about an hour out in the Atlantic, driving that boat. You know, Andy went out first with his family, and then the people who paid all the money to keep it restored, they went out on the second trip. And then us people from Colorado that didn't know any better, we went out on the third trip. And that's the 36-500 movie, and we all lost Andy. He was the last living crew member, and he was the last living member of all of them that they rescued off of the Pendleton. He was the last person alive, so he could tell any story he wanted. Nobody was different.
Nobody argued with him either.
Well, Barnstable has a very nice Coast Guard historic museum there, and they have a big exhibit about.
Where's that?
In Barnstable.
So, any other questions?
I just have it, but I was in Newport last summer.
Rhode Island?
What a delightful place it's turned.
Or Oregon?
It's turned into
Newport, Rhode Island, or?
It's turned into a tourist thing. I don't know if you've been back.
Is it Newport, Rhode Island, or
No, Oregon.
Oregon? Okay.
Yeah, and, but the Coast Guard station, they were still very active.
That's where I was. Yep.
Beautiful place.
Just short last question. I didn't realize you had a reserve presence in, places like this in Omaha. Do you have any responsibility in any of the major U.S. rivers? Do you do research and rescue up in Mississippi?
They'll deal with aids to navigation in every navigable river. So the Omaha presence over there there's like a little tugboat with a pusher barge in front of it, and that takes care of aids to navigation from, I think, Sioux City all the way down to almost Leavenworth. And then there's another cutter in Leavenworth that takes care of the lower Missouri River. So they're responsible for all the aids up there on that river. And then the Mississippi River, and I don't remember how far up they go, but the Ohio, anything that would support interstate commerce will have a Coast Guard presence, however so slight. Oh, they tried when we were here doing boating safety. They said Navajo Reservoir is on the state line between Colorado and New Mexico, so we really have jurisdiction on that. And Flaming Gorge between Wyoming and Utah also could have interstate commerce. I don't know if they take liquor into Utah or something. I don't know what they do. Okay, you can guess. But we had jurisdiction on Flaming Gorge, and we did a lot of boating safety out of there for a long time. We were out of Buckboard Marina, which is a highlight. But we worked boating safety out of there. And a lot of it was education, and it was checking for safety equipment, but mainly just PR and education is what we did up there.
You'd see them quite often on the Hudson River because
Oh, yeah.
the buoys along there just get washed away with the ice flows every year. So I see your buoy tenders often.
Any other questions? Yeah.
Last.
How do helicopters come into the mix with ships for rescues and whatever?
I don't know the answer to that. Probably with the icebreakers first. I think they were probably one of the first ones that had compartments, covered housing really that they could put helicopters in. And they would use that to look for ice leads. Originally they used fixed wing planes. The 255s that Jack and I were on were icebreaker hulled, but they could do ice breaking duties, but they weren't icebreakers. And they had a fixed wing plane originally assigned to them that they could stick out and launch and would look for ice leads. That was I don't think maybe one ship got commissioned that actually had a plane on it, and that didn't last long at all. And then none of the other 13 had anything. The larger cutters then, the 210s that were built probably in Jack, late
45
60s.
years ago.
Yeah, they had a helicopter landing platform on them, and at 210 foot, that's pretty small. When I was on the 210 for a trip, boy, there's like 5 feet of rotor clearance when they get down, but there's no place to cover them up. You can land them and tie them down, and they were using them for drug interdiction stuff off of California and Mexico coast, and they were using the choppers for that.
So like the Kevin Costner movie with all the rescue helicopter, that's what that whole thing was about.
Oh, all right, but those guys were land-based. I thought you were talking about shipboard-based. Okay. God, the helicopters probably started in the early 50s with the Coast Guard, with search and rescue. And some of the old Sikorskis and that. I mean, HU-52s were kind of the main stable in the 60s. But they were jet powered, not piston powered. But yeah, they'd fly them down from Astoria down to the Oregon coast. It would take them an hour and a half to get there to do anything, and then they opened up an air station down at Coos Bay in the lower Oregon coast, and they had an air station there that they would fly helicopters out of. But yeah, the ones that land in the water are gone. They had enough trouble with that they don't have any more that can actually put down on the water. But those guys that could put them on that were flying in the 60s were nuts. They had them over in Vietnam trying to get pilots rescued over there because of their search and rescue experience. But we had them in Oregon one time, and they had a guy in an inner tube and kind of in like a big eddy, couldn't get out of it, but it was probably 15-foot high surf, and we couldn't get the boat in there because it was too shallow. And the helicopter pilot would look at where this guy was and move over, and as the wave went by, he would land on the back of the wave and let the wave go by, and then they would try to grab him. And then here would come another wave, and they'd pick that chopper up, let that go underneath him, and they'd reposition that. And they probably did that a dozen times, and then finally the inner tube just went straight up in the air, and they knew the guy was out of his. That was the end of the search and rescue.
Any other one last question?
Yeah, your station in Vietnam, was it always off of northern South Vietnam, or did you get down in the Four Corps?
I'm trying to think of how many sectors there were, but they started up at the DMZ, and I think there was 5. Anyway, it depended. We were up in Sector 1, which was from the DMZ down to Da Nang one time, and most of the other times we were pretty much down along, what do you call it, the Parrots Beak, down south and then up toward the Cambodian border. We probably spent more time down there. I got lucky and I got the Navy to take my appendix out in Da Nang, which promptly got infected and spent another month there, but I blame the Navy for that.
Describe how you got in from there to hockey.
Well, that's a long story. I played hockey as a kid, and I played down at DU and as a kid, and then service came back and got on a men's league team when I came back, and then played for a few years and got a couple shoulder separations and found out that I wasn't like a college kid. We were playing CU and Regis and DU and those guys, and I couldn't climb a ladder and be an electrician if I couldn't get my arm up above here. So I had a doctor tell me that you need to find something quieter to do. So I started refereeing then, and I refereed for 20 some years, and then went back into playing when the guys got older and calmed down a little bit. But refereed for 45 years here in Colorado up to the college level. And I still played one on Wednesday with a bunch of old guys like you. Like you. You get in the locker room and somebody's got a pacemaker, somebody's got a replacement hip, and somebody's got, and everybody knows if you fall down wrong, you may not do it again. So it's a pretty neat bunch of guys, and we've been playing together for about 65 years.
Oh my.
Well, Tom, thank you so much for being our
Thank you.
Incorporate the Coast Guard as part of our expansion into the Cold War room upstairs. So maybe get one or more of your models on occasion. So please, stick around, talk some more with Tom. We have plenty of refreshments left. Visit the museum, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.